Where were you as the invasion began?
I was in Leominster, England, at the 76th General Hospital, and we were preparing our hospital for D-Day. We were visited around in England while we were waiting, and we happened to be at Kidderminster when we got the call to return back to our station. So we went back to the hospital. At 2:30 on the 7th, we received our first convoy of patients from D-Day. And from then they kept on coming. And most of them were sent back to the United States, evacuated back to the United States. And then when it was safe, in August, about the 13th, 14th of August, where they took us to Southampton, and there we waited on the beach for the ship. And we crossed the English Channel on the USS, I'm sorry, the wrong one, on the Deutschland. It was a Dutch ship. So we boarded the Dutch ship to cross the English Channel. And it so happened that I had a toothache. And so I went to the dentist on board, and he said, "Your teeth are perfect. There's nothing wrong with your teeth." And so I thought, well, they must think I'm gold bricking, because that happened to some of the soldiers. But I had pain, and I couldn't lie down to sleep, so I sat up to sleep on the 3 days that it took us to cross the channel. And I guess the channel wasn't that wide, except the weather interfered. So it took us 3 days. And during that time, I sat up to sleep because of the pain. So when we landed, we had to climb down a rope ladder into a landing barge. And the landing barge took us ashore. And the landing barge that I was on dropped the front down on land. So we walked ashore. We didn't have to get wet. But some of them, I guess, had to wade ashore. So we were at Utah Beach. We landed at Utah Beach near Khartoum. And we camped there at Khartoum for a while. But the first thing for me was to tell the dentist again. And he took me to a dental clinic that was set up in a tent. And they did a root canal in my front tooth. The pain had localized to my front tooth. And so I had a root canal done there. It was set up, they had all the instruments and everything, just like modern anywhere.
Wow.
So that was perfect.
So that helped.
And I went back several times for a checkup because we spent several weeks there in the cow pasture. And at the end, they said I was a good patient and they wanted to give me a steak dinner, which was a little far out.
It was. And it didn't hurt to eat it at that point.
Yeah,
So that
right.
was good.
Right.
Talk about the setting up the hospital in the pasture.
Well, we actually didn't set up a hospital there. We camped there for several weeks and waiting. And they warned us about walking out because of landmines and to be careful, where we walked. And we were able to see the pillboxes that were set up there, the German pillboxes, and the German tanks that had been knocked out. And I have a picture in my book of one German tank. And during that time, they let us go to St. Marcella, and we got to visit there and see the chapel above Mount St. Michel. Mm-hmm. And there was a French lady that put on a banquet for us. And it was in a low building. It wasn't a fancy type building, but she set up this banquet in this little building. And she sang the French national anthem for the first time since the German occupation, and she cried. So that was a big treat. So we spent time there in the cow pasture waiting for the next assignment. Then they took us up into Paris, France. And the hospital Boujan, French hospital, had been overtaken by the Germans. And so I have a picture of the hospital with the German flag hanging outside. And then I believe when the Americans took it over, it was the 108th General Hospital, and that's what we knew. And so we were there temporarily assigned, and we worked there just temporarily. And there was one evening when they let us go downtown, and we went to see it, Holly's entertainment
Right.
and dinner. There was one night. And then another time they allowed us to see the Eiffel Tower. So we had pictures taken there. But you couldn't go beyond the first level at the Eiffel Tower because of the war and the buzz bombs.
Describe the buzz bombs. What's it like to be near them when they're coming down?
I can't tell you how large they were, but they're quite, probably as long as this room, I would guess. And they're large around, probably, I don't know, I'm not good at guessing, but it was a large bomb. And there were two kinds, there were V1 and V2, but I'm not that familiar and I can't explain them that well. But I'm getting ahead of my story.
Sure.
Shall I go ahead?
Please.
We had bus bombs night and day in Liège, Belgium. And the patients had the sky divided into 3 areas. And the middle area was, they called Buzz Bomb Alley. So when they hollered Buzz Bomb Alley, you were supposed to take cover. And the other 2, I can't remember what they named them, but they came off in every few minutes. And at one time, a patient said there were 4 in the sky at one time. And they made a lot of noise. I could go on and tell you.
Go ahead.
On January 8th, I'm getting ahead of my story. On January 8th, 1945, a buzz bomb hit our hospital. And it hit in the area where the military police were getting ready for bed. And it killed 25 of our men. I didn't know them personally, but I would see them stand guard here and there at the hospital. One was a little short, happy-go-lucky guy, would wave and smile, and I didn't even know his name. But I had worked night duty on the shock ward that night, and I was getting off, going back to my tent, and the nurse was coming. She was crying. She said, "Don't go there." She said, "It's awful. Her limbs all over." She said, "They'll need you tonight. Go back, get some sleep. They'll need you tonight." So I listened to her, and I went to my tent and slept. I'm so glad that I never saw that. Years later, we had reunions in Des Moines, Iowa. And one time, the administrative officer came, and he said it was his duty to identify those men. And it was so awful, he said, that he had to leave and go off by himself. And he cried, and he vomited, and he went back. But there was one that he could not identify, so they had to report him missing in action. And then another time at our reunion, someone wrote in, I have the letter. He said that about 50 feet away from the buzz bomb site, they found a hand. And on that hand was a ring, and that was his friend's ring. So he knew that that was his friend's ring, his friend's hand. They made a plaque to the 25 men. And we never knew what happened to that plaque when we left Liège. And many years later, my sister and I, not my sister, my daughter, Kathy, and I, we went to Paris, France. And I wanted to find that plaque if there was a way that I could find it. So we landed in Paris. We took a train up to Liège, Belgium. And at an information counter, I explained to this man what I was looking for. And he didn't know anything about it. But there was a man that came up for my right. And he said, "Lady, because of you, we are free. Thank you." And he left. There was another lady sitting there on the other side. She got up. She said, "Well, I'll take you any place you want to go." And she had to call the university where she worked to get away. So she took us to her home, offered us the use of her bathroom, lunch. She showed me the room where her mother had recently passed away from cancer. And she took us to the Henry Chapelle Cemetery. There they had a huge log, and in that log they had the list of the 25 men. So I was able to see that. And I met Ferdinand Decenti. He was the superintendent there. He said, "When you go home," he said, "if you send me pictures of the area where you were, I'll try to identify the place where your hospital was, and I'll see what I can do." So I did that. I sent a picture of the plaque and the area where we were, and he identified the place. And they had built up a transportation company there by then. And when they heard the story, they reconstructed the plaque, and they fixed an area outside their transportation company in honor of these men. And later, much later, at our reunion, one of the members visited over Liège with his family, and he came back to report. And he was so emotional, he could hardly tell us about the transportation company and what they had done in reconstructing the plaque and all that they did.
The reason you were in Liège was to help deal with casualties from the Battle of the Bulge, correct?
I'm sorry?
You were dealing with casualties from the Battle of the Bulge while you were at Liège.
Yes.
Yes. Describe what that was like.
Well, we didn't know what was going on as far as the war was. But we heard that the Germans had overtaken the Americans at the Battle of the Bulge, and they were headed for the port of Antwerp, and we were in between. So our hospital would be taken over. And so they told us be packed and ready to be evacuated on a moment's notice. And so that was all we knew. But I guess later we heard that the Germans had put in, like, I can't tell you the figure of army that they overtook the Americans, but they had overtaken the Americans and were headed for the port of Antwerp. But we knew that we were close because they would light up the night sky like day, and we could hear the trucks going hour after hour down the streets of Liège. One time it looked like the river was on fire, the Liège River, the river that went through Liège.
Yeah.
Yes, it looked like it was on fire. And we could feel the concussion of the ack on the ground. It was so strong.
Wow.
So, and I guess they had a list of those who had to stay with the patients who couldn't be moved, and we never did see that list.
Did you have a lot of patients dealing with frostbite and other things related to the cold as well, or was it mostly war injuries?
Well, my ward was A number 1, the first ward in the hospital, and it was a surgical ward. So other wards took care of the patient that you asked about. And I guess there was one ward that was filled with soldiers with foot rot, the late term.
Yeah.
but they had foot problems, and some were amputees, and so they had a full ward of those. And that wasn't my ward, so I can't report on that.
How advanced could you get in the surgery where you were?
Mine was A number 1, the first ward in the hospital. And we had sent our patients to and from surgery all the time. And we had a lot of blood transfusions, IVs, and recovery, vital signs. And so we were busy all the time. Sometimes I'd get patients that would stay overnight in my ward and back to the United States. So they were just moving fast. It was wartime and things were fast moving. They'd come in and go. One night I got a personal ward, my ward, just overnight. But that look, I can't forget that look. The skin stretched over his bones, and that vacant stare, and the wouldn't talk. I can't, that's embedded in my memory. It was just overnight there. There was another time that they brought in a soldier on the 6-inch legs on a stretcher. They laid him down by my desk in the front door. He hollered my name, Marcella. And he happened to be from home, from the school that I went to. And his name was Willie. And there was Willie laying in my ward just overnight on his way back.
What are the odds of that?
I'm sorry?
I said, what are the odds of that?
I know.
From the same hometown.
And we had German prisoners of war that worked throughout our hospital. I guess there was a camp nearby, and we weren't supposed to talk to them. But occasionally they would help take the patient to and from surgery. And we had those high litters. And it was winter time, so we covered them with tarp, covered them over while they went to and from surgery. My doctor was Dr. Thompson, and he was a surgeon. So he was in surgery most of the time and would come and make his rounds and go back. And I had Sergeant Willie and Private Coffee and one nurse that helped me. It was Mabel Peterson and myself. And we were just so busy, just giving blood transfusions, IVs, and penicillin. Penicillin was new then. And they had a penicillin team. We just had to turn in the name of someone who was to receive penicillin, and they would come around every 4 hours and give the shots.
How long did you stay in Liège? Did you stay there even after the battle was done?
We were there almost a year to the day.
So even through the end of the war then?
Right.
And when did you come home then?
I think it was 45 or 46.
And what did you do when you came home?
Well, I went to stay with my sister for a while. She happened to be taking nurses training under the Nurse Cadet Corps, and she wanted to be a nurse and go into the service like I did. And she was taking her nurses training in Chicago, so I stayed with her for a while.
And did you continue on as a nurse?
Oh, yes. I was unsettled for a while, worked here and there. And then eventually I went back to Rapid City and was there temporarily. And there were signs in the bars as you walked down the streets, no Indians or dogs allowed.
How did that make you feel? I mean, you've done all this for your country. The military treated you great, and then you go back home.
I never experienced any discrimination at all in the service. They accepted me for what I was able to do. And then I come back to South Dakota, my state, and saw this sign. And the law was that anything that had alcohol in it, we couldn't buy, like even vanilla extract with alcohol in it, or rubbing alcohol. I went to a drugstore at home to buy some rubbing alcohol, and the dignified lady in the city of Mobridge, She said, we don't have any. So I went back to the grocery store where I traded and knew the man. He said, well, that's strange. He said, at their drugstore. So he went over there and he bought me 2 bottles. So she lied to me.
Of course she did.
And I said, they had a law in South Dakota, where the Indians couldn't buy anything with alcohol in it. But that law was changed, I believe, in 1950 something. And I said, you can change the law, but you can't change the hearts of men.
Speaking of laws, I know that Congress is considering a bill that you are very interested in. What would it do?
I think you're talking about remove the stain.
Yes, the one that Congress is currently
Yes.
considering.
I've been involved in the Wounded Knee massacre for a number of years. And back home, I say that there's a pervasive sadness that exists on our reservation because of Wounded Knee and unresolved grief. In Wounded Knee, they massacred about 250 to 300 Native Americans, women, children, men, women, and children. And they gave 20 medals of honor to the 7th Cavalry for bravery. That has affected the people on our reservation. We have descendants there. And at one time, I was asked to be the secretary to the Wounded Knee Survivors Association. And I'm not a descendant, but at the time I was serving on the tribal council. And the president, Burdell Bluearm, asked me if I would be their secretary. So I was. I was glad to help in any way I could. And so at one point, my son Richard and I, we went to Glasgow, Scotland, where they had a ghost dance shirt that was taken from Wounded Knee after the massacre. And so, to make a long story short, we went for the first time in 1995. And Mario Gonzalez, the attorney, he told the story, and he told it like no one else could tell that. He was an attorney, and he was a descendant of Dewey Bird, who was at Wounded Knee. So there was a man that was adamantly opposed to the return of the ghost shirt. So nothing happened in 1995. But in 1998, my son Richard and I, we went over. I wrote my story at the hearing. We had to wait 5 days for the city to meet and to vote on it. When they voted in favor of letting the ghost shirt come back. So we couldn't just pick it up and bring it home. They had to go through all their laws and all their procedures, and besides that, they wanted to come back to our reservation and bring the ghost shirt themselves. So John Lynch, Mark O'Neill, Liz Cameron, and John Lynch's wife, they came. They got as far as St. Paul, Minneapolis. When they got there, the authorities realized that there was an eagle feather on the ghost shirt. So they wouldn't let them leave there with the ghost shirt. And a friend of ours, Alan Duke, was coming from Woodstock, Georgia. And so he picked it up for us and brought it to Eagle Butte. So we had our ceremonies there. We even had bagpipes. They offered to come and play. Mm-hmm. We had a ceremony in Eagle Butte and one at the gravesite. And then we went to Pierre. We had to sign a contract that we would keep it in a climate-controlled place until we had a place of our own. So we contracted with the Pierre Heritage Center to hold it for us. And that's where it is yet today. But to go on, lately, some folks back home, they started, they wanted to request that the Medal of Honor be revoked. And it's the bill that's called Remove the Stain, and the number is 3467. And it's making its way now. And initially we met with Deb Hablin and two men, one a Republican and one a Democrat. And so they signed on to the bill, and it's moving ahead right now. But I don't know where it is right today.
Okay. So House Resolution 3467. Marcella, we're just about out of time, but I want to ask you one more question, and it goes back to your service in World War II. What does it mean to you that you made such a big difference in the lives of these men who had been injured in a variety of ways, whether it's at Normandy or at the Battle of the Bulge or anywhere else that you treated soldiers from, the fact that you helped them recover and return to their lives?
You know, it was one of the greatest honors, privileges of my life. I could tell you a story. I was working on the shock ward, my tour of duty, night duty, and a nurse asked me to go see this Native American. He had lost both legs above the knee, and they thought he was suicidal, and he might try to commit suicide. And they were afraid to let him shave with a razor blade. So I went to see him. His name was Eugene Rubidoux from Rosebud, South Dakota. I visited with him. I offered to write letters for him, and he didn't want to write home. And I was afraid to ask him how he received his injuries. I didn't have the heart to ask him. But I went to visit him as often as I could, and one day he was gone. I went back to Eagle Butte finally and worked at the local Indian Health Service hospital. I went to many conferences, and I would ask people from Rosebud, do you know Eugene Rubidoux? It took me 40 years to find him. And finally, one day, there was a young lady came, did a workshop, and left. She called the next morning, and she said, ask my name, identified myself, and she said, do you know Eugene Rubidoux? And I said, yes, and then I got all choked up. She said, he's my father. And there were two of us, my brother and I. He got a divorce and he left. He's in Yankton. He remarried, has a family, gave me his phone number, his address. I waited a couple of days and I called him. I said, do you remember the nurse that stood at your bedside in Liège, Belgium? He said, I'll never forget.
Did you ever see him?
We invited him. I belonged to the Post 308 Legion Auxiliary at home. I told them about it and the auxiliary as well. They offered to help me. So we invited him to Eagle Butte to honor him. We had a dinner for him in a gathering of veterans. He walked to the podium with the native a cane and thanked us. And then I learned that he was a role model, and he was invited back many times to the VA to talk to other amputees and encourage them.
It's an incredible story.